So I already said it feels great to be the one to welcome you tonight, but it also feels quite strange because I'm so used to being among you all for stimulating events of just this sort about Israel. And of course, usually it's Michael Brenner himself welcoming us, right? Working together with Laura, Michael, as you know, brings us together for all sorts of programming in quite diverse fields, right? Politics, history, literature, dance, art, food, water, high tech, right? And when Michael does it, he makes it all look so easy. We're used to his geniality when he comes up here and welcomes us. We're used to his generosity as a host. We're used to his erudition, right? When he comes up and does the welcome, it's bringing together so much knowledge, so much wide-ranging knowledge. And now we're here on the very happy occasion of the publication of his wonderful new book about Israel. So it's our turn to celebrate Michael himself and see a little bit of where all that erudition comes from. So to introduce him, I want to hand over the mic to my colleague, my dear colleague, Professor Pam NADELL of the History Department and the Director of the Jewish Studies Program.
Thank you. Good evening. So before I actually do the introductions, I'm going to do a little bit of bragging. This year, the Jewish Studies program has 2 students graduating, Alicia Martin and Aaron Torup, and both of them were just elected to Phi Beta Kappa. So where are you? Will you stand up? Come on, stand up. Wonderful students learn from outstanding faculty, and tonight we have 2 terrific faculty members with us. The first is Arie Dubnov, I'm going to introduce, and he is the Max Ticktin Chair in Israel Studies at George Washington University. Before he joined us in Washington this year, he taught at Stanford and at the University of Haifa. His books include the intellectual biography, Isaiah Berlin, The Journey of a Jewish Liberal, and the edited volume, Zionism, A View from the Outside. And he has published widely in journals in his field, including, of course, the Journal of Israeli History. He is currently researching British Mandate-era ideas about partitioning Palestine and other political solutions to competing claims for the land that were debated in that era. And he's going to join Professor Brenner in dialogue, but Professor Brenner is going to open for us this evening. And I know he doesn't need any introduction, but I still want to introduce him. He is the Seymour and Lillian Abensohn Chair in Israel Studies and Director of American University's Center for Israel Studies, and we are celebrating his 5th year with us. He also holds the chair in Jewish History and Culture at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, where he teaches in the summers. He has held teaching positions at Indiana and Brandeis Universities and was a visiting scholar at Stanford, Berkeley, Johns Hopkins, and Haifa Universities, and Budapest Central European University. He is also the international president of the Leo Baeck Institute for the Study of German Jewry and an elected member of the Bavarian Academy of Science and other academies of distinguished scholars. In 2014, he received the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. His previous books have been translated into 10 languages, so that's in case you don't read them all in English. I will recommend only for brevity's sake A Short History of Zionism, A Short History of the Jews, and Zionism, A Brief History, which my students know they have to read in their classes. This evening, he will start our program sharing with us insights from his new book, just published by Princeton University Press, In Search of Israel, The History of an Idea. Please welcome Professor Brenner.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Pam. Oh, I think I should use this one, right? Second. I'll turn that off. Well, that sounds good? You can hear me? Okay. Thank you for coming, and thank you for these very generous introductions. And and it is a real honor for me to present my book here at American University. which I have been proud to call my home for the last 5 years now. And let me just start by thanking those who have made me feel at home here. First of all, of course, I would like to thank the two speakers before me, my long-term department chair and friend, Pam NADELL, and the acting dean and friend, Lisa LEFF, and also the other colleagues from the history department who are here tonight and who made it really a wonderful experience in the last 5 years to be part of this department and part of this university. And as was mentioned already before, our Center for Israel Studies would not be what it is today without Laura Cutler. And Laura, I think the two of us had put together quite some programs in the last 5 years, and we're looking forward to the next 5 years for the next programs. And we, of course, are always happy to see you again at these occasions. In fact, we're planning the next conference for this fall right now. The support of our council has also been crucial for realizing all of these programs, and I'm really happy to see many of our council members here tonight. Thank you all for your support, and let me also mention Lillian Abensohn, who has been here, and I think from the first moment we have not only become colleagues and struggling for the same cause, but also friends, and I really very much appreciate that friendship. Neither would I be here, nor would the book exist without Michelle Engert, my wife and colleague now, who has gone through all of its stages together with me, who supported me every single minute, even though she had to listen to way too much obscure chapters of Israeli history than anyone ever should, who walked with me through many versions of the manuscript and who walked with me through the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa and other places in the world and in Israel, and who after her own successful legal career found also a new home here at American University. So thank you very much, Michelle. And I want to talk today about what made me write this book and a little bit of what it is about. And I'll speak for a few minutes and then we'll continue with my dear colleague, Arie Dubnov from GW. So Israel is a small country. In fact, it ranks as number 148 out of 196 independent states in terms of geographical area. And it's number 98, at least it was a year ago, in terms of population. It's somewhere located in this respect between Belize and Djibouti. Now, we don't have a Center for Belize and Djibouti Studies here at AU, or to the best of my knowledge, at any other US university. In fact, the international attraction the attention Israel attracts is exponentially greater than that of either. In fact, a future historian who would, in, let's say, a couple of centuries, read only the media coverage of this time period might think that Israel is a state of the size of the United States of America, China, or Russia. In the United States, Israel has figured more prominently over the last 3 decades than almost any other foreign country in terms of, especially when it comes to foreign policy debates. In polls across Europe, Israel is considered often, consistently, to be the greatest danger to world peace. And in Islamic societies, it has become routine to burn Israeli flags and argue for Israel's demise, even for people who have no idea about where the state is located or what it is about. No other country in the world has been the subject of as many UN resolutions as Israel. They're not usually positive. At the same time, though, many people around the world credit Israel with a unique role in the future course of world history. Evangelical Christians regard the Jewish state as a major player in their eschatological model of the world. Their convictions have influenced U.S. policies in the Middle East and the opinions of some political leaders in other parts of the world, especially Central America, as well. So, what I was interested in was the question, why is that so? And of course, the answer lies deep in history, and it needs many volumes to really dig into that. No worries, Michelle, I'm done with that. Many people call Israel the Holy Land for a reason. It is here, of course, where the origins of their own religions were shaped. The Jewish people, too, are regarded as special over time. They played a crucial role in the theological framework of the world's dominant religions, in Christianity and Islam. Jews were both seen as a people especially close to God and at the same time uniquely rejected by God. While over the last 200 years, these ideas have become secularized, many stereotypes have remained. That the Jews became victims of the most systematic genocide in modern history lent them yet another mark of uniqueness. And maybe also the fact that after 2,000 years in exile, the fact that the Jews returned to their ancient homeland to build a sovereign state, surrounded Jews with a certain specific mystique. All of this by itself would be an interesting study, but that was not exactly what I was mainly interested in. I was looking more into the internal answer to this question. What did the Zionists think? What did the leaders of the Zionist movement from Theodor Herzl onwards think, and the leaders of Israel after 1948? The Zionist enterprise, of course, started out in some respect as an attempt, as what many Zionists called, to normalize Jewish history. Zionism, so the explanation often goes, came into existence to finally put an end to the millennia-old story of the Jews as what they have been for many, many centuries, the archetypical other. And that would be done by creating a state that, again, phrase very popular, certainly in the early Zionist period, a state like any other state. And this phrase, kechol am ve'am, even entered Israel's Declaration of Independence. However, and that's what I'm trying to show on the other side, this was not the whole picture. Indeed, I would argue it was only the smaller part of the picture. There was at the same time always, within the Zionist movement and until today, the striving for an opposite ideal. The ideal to be a model to the world, a light unto the nations, or lagoyim. A Jewish state, these and often the same Zionists argued, had to reach for higher ideals than other nations. It had to be unique, not despite, but because of its specific history. But what exactly this uniqueness would represent was open for new interpretations over different generations and periods. So these two contrasting, and I would say often conflicting aspirations, have characterized the Zionist movement from its very outset and the State of Israel during the last 70 years. The idea that a Jewish state had to be different, had to be in fact better than other states, was deeply ingrained in the early Zionist movement. Theodor Herzl believed, on the one hand, that only when the Jews, like all other nations, had their own state, anti-Semitism would cease, would disappear, and they would be respected by the world. But he also was convinced this new state had to serve as a model for all of humanity. He did not speak about Israel. That word really does not appear, a state of Israel. Actually, he called the state the 7-hour land. Why the 7-hour land? See my students? He thought it would be 7 working hours of the day. We'd be happy if we had that today, but back in 1896, when Herzl wrote that, that was truly revolutionary. He thought it was so important that he even drew the flag of Israel. He drew it by hand, and you can see the drawing until today. He drew it with 7 stars because he thought it's so important. It's nothing Jewish, right? It's an ideal which aspired for a model society for all humanity, not just for Judaism. And Herzl, in fact, had much more ambitious plans of what he called an experiment for the well-being of all humanity. In his view, a Jewish state was to become a model state for all nations and religions. As he wrote, the land of the 7-hour working day will be not only a model country for social experiments and a treasure house for works of art, but a miracle country in all civilization. So Herzl's vision embodies a paradox that Zionism would never be able, or no movement would be able to solve, to turn the Jews into a nation like any other nation, while at the same time entrusting them with a state that would be better, or a model for everyone. And in fact, Israel's first prime minister, and of course I'm skipping a lot of chapters from the book now, but Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, in many ways the founder of the State of Israel, wanted to have it both ways too. And there are many references I could refer to. I'm reading one, just giving you one example from what he writes in Israel's government yearbook. So that's really an official publication. In the 1950s, he says, 2 basic aspirations underlie all of our work in this country: to be like all other nations and to be different from all the nations. These 2 aspirations are apparently contradictory, but in fact they are complementary and interdependent. We want to be a free people, independent and equal in rights, in a family of nations, and we aspire to be different from all other nations in our spiritual elevation and in the character of our model society founded on freedom, cooperation, and fraternity, and so on. And Ben-Gurion's priority between the 2 was pretty clear if you go through his texts. His priority was given to the model and not to be like any other nation. In this prophetic vision, and he very much, as a secular, socialist Zionist, very much liked to quote and also refer to the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. He drew on this prophetic model of a light unto the nations. And so did his internal opponents. One of them, Nachum Goldman, longtime leader of the Zionist movement and of the World Jewish Congress, not a friend of, well, a rival for many years of Ben-Gurion, who otherwise agrees with very little what Ben-Gurion said. On the occasion of Herzl's centenary, he wrote the following: "Do you think that what other nations admired about Zionism was the fact that the Jews too wanted a state with ministers, ambassadors, cabinet crises," yes, they have them, "and a flag, as if the world had not enough states yet? In the historical perspective," Goldman says, "what inspired the finest of the Jews with enthusiasm for Zionism was precisely its utopian aspects. Jews," he said, "have still to cling to the great humanitarian ideals, not the short-sighted provincial realism of some groups in Israel." And Ben-Gurion's most fierce opponent within Israeli politics, Menachem Begin, much later than his also successor, was also convinced, but in a different way, that the Jews were a unique people with a unique destiny. He meant something quite different than both Herzl or Ben-Gurion when he spoke of uniqueness. Ben-Gurion had combined prophetic teachings and secular socialist principles in his efforts to create a model state. And while biblical writings had influenced Begin as well, his heroes were not the prophets in the Bible, but the ancient fighters, from Joshua to King David, associated with the Jewish return to the land of Israel and the establishment of a kingdom of Israel. He was profoundly attentive to the actions of the many enemies of the Jewish people mentioned in the Bible, from the Amalekites to Haman. Begin never ceased to believe that most of the world hated the Jews and that Israel had to take on the fight against the dark elements of humankind. And Begin also gave legitimacy to the rising force of religious Zionists after his election as prime minister. This new spirit could be felt at the very night of what was called the Mahapach, the political turnover of 1977, when television viewers were witness to a rather unusual scene. In the Likud headquarters, a group played traditional Hasidic melodies, and a bearded Jew blew the shofar. There was a kind of messianic spirit in the air. And maybe it signaled a change over, not of course in a year or 2 years, but over the decades which started in 1967. A change where also Orthodox Zionism was now on the rise, with clear expectations that a Jewish state could not just be, again, a state like any other state, but with different ideas. While the early religious Zionist Mizrahi movement was dominated by the belief that Messianism could be neutralized, meaning a Jewish state would actually serve the humanitarian needs of the Jewish people, of refugees from Europe, but didn't have a real theological meaning. And that's, by the way, why early Mizrahi in the early 1900s, they voted, many of them voted for the Uganda plan. They thought that's a great solution. We'll go to East Africa, we save the Jews, and we won't come into conflict with the messianic ideas that only God can bring the Jews back to the Holy Land, to Israel. So a lot of the religious Zionists were in favor, which sounds surprising today, for the Uganda solution in the early 1900s. An early champion of the more activist brand of Messianic Zionism was Rabbi Avram Isaac Kook, the first chief rabbi of Palestine in the 1920s. In his opinion, even when they were violating Jewish religious laws, the Zionists were unintentionally performing holy deeds by propelling the Jews back to their land. So without knowing, they did holy deeds. As he said, the divine spirit prevails in their aspirations, even against their own wills. Kook argued that the future Jewish state cannot be a state like any other state, but for him, the reason was, as the state of Israel, he says, is the foundation of God's throne on earth, directed towards the unity of the Lord and his name. So very different from Ben-Gurion, from Herzl, from Begin as well. So as Israel turns 70, its demography looks very different than at the time of its founding, or even than 20 years ago. And I would like to recall a quite important speech Israeli President Reuven Rivlin gave about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, where he pointed out that for the first time in Israeli history, less than 50% of the first graders attend a secular public Israeli school. So more than 50% attend either a state religious school, an Orthodox private school, ultra-Orthodox private school, though very heavily, of course, subsidized by the state, or an Arab school. So about 50% or more than 50% of Israeli first graders are no longer part of what was the core of Israel's original population, secular Jews. And keeping this in mind, I think we have to realize that Israel, in fact, changes its face, and what seemed to be marginal, and also what seemed to be marginal in terms of claiming the uniqueness of Israel, the unique spirit of Israel, has now turned more and more to religion. And by the way, this is not only true for Israel's Jews or for Israel in general. It is also true for a large part of American of Americans, because if you look at American Jews, they usually, their majority are either moderate religious or secular. But if you look at the evangelical Protestant population, the role Israel plays in their concept of the world and of the world to come is very different than for most of the Jewish population. It has a much more religious meaning for many Christian Americans than for Jewish Americans. So I'm just, mentioning a few of the aspects I'm dealing with different chapters in this book. So can Israel one day become just a state like any other state, a normal state? I should qualify this question by stating that the idea of a normal state, of course, in a way is a fiction altogether. In a way, every state sees itself as different, as special, certainly in the United States do. But it is true that some states receive more attention from the rest of the world than others. Can Israel just be another state in the eyes of the world, or relegated in our attention to, let's say, Djibouti or Belize? I guess no. The history of Jerusalem, of Israel, is just too loaded, and the Jews have attracted so much attention throughout history that cannot be dissolved within a generation or two. Thus, Israel will most likely always remain in the limelight of media attention. However, we should also think about the fact that for everyday life for the people in Israel, that is different. They, like everywhere else, worry about their jobs and about their sports teams, and they want their children to be safe and successful in school, and they dream of a peaceful future. And in this very deeply personal sense, Israel has become a state just like any other state. So there are different levels, and I think that's all I want to just present in terms of some of the points I try to discuss in the book, and hopefully we'll dive more into them in our conversation, which is following now. Thank you.
Okay, good. Can you hear me? Okay, good evening, everyone. So first of all, Michael, in addition to thanking you for inviting me, I do need to compliment you, because as an academic, professional historian myself, I know how hard it is in our time and age when we're expected to write about micro history or take a specific case. As the joke goes, we know more and more about less and less until we know everything about nothing. To do something of that sort of scope and breadth and ask big questions. And this is so beautifully rendered and offers this very broad canvas that I think is also very accessible to the larger public, which is really an achievement. So I applaud you in offering this and making our scholarship accessible in so many ways. It's interesting that you started both your comments and the book. You started off with this famous, or at least famous comment, anecdote among the historians about Albania. Yeah, the anecdote, for those of you who is not familiar, when it came to us through Isaiah Berlin, that attended a party in which someone came and asked Chaim Weizmann, so what, the entire project is here about? That's the big deal, turning Jews into Albanians? Looking, fast forward, whether it's 70 years from 1948 or even going backwards, because you do take us on a trip, on a voyage that starts with the history of Zionism. Is this project of normalization still the main driving force? And even, is it succeeding or failing?
Well, it depends on whose perspective you look. My last chapter in the book deals with actually I have almost two last chapters. Last chapter I'm going to have a conclusion. And the last chapter deals, and we can talk about this later, deals with the Israeli diaspora, because one of the ideas of Zionism was there should not be a Jewish diaspora anymore. All Jews should. Herzl was convinced whoever remains Jewish would move to this 7-hour land, to the Jewish state, and the others would assimilate it and cease to be Jews over time. So not only is there still a Jewish diaspora, but there is another diaspora, which is the Israeli diaspora. And the question I'm asking is this good or bad for Israel? I mean, if you look at Israel as a state like any other state, it's normal. Every country has expats. Every country, and Israel doesn't have percentage-wise more really than most European countries or the United States who live outside the state. So in a way, it's a sign of normalization. But then, and that was just to say the kind of conclusion, is a comparison of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv today. And, you know, most of you have been probably, or many of you have been to Israel, and it's so, you know, it's so close to each other. And with the new high-speed train, even less than half an hour from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, but it is increasingly different worlds. And in a way, I think Tel Aviv is the normalization model. You know, Tel Aviv wants to be, in many ways, a little Manhattan or little, you know, Europe, Mediterranean part of Europe. And Jerusalem certainly wants to be a very different and unique place, which it is. The history also tells it is. But it also is a city which is increasingly religious. And Tel Aviv, I would say, increasingly secular. So you have this gap. And now, is this good or bad? I mean, I would say the good thing is you have both. As long as both can continue to live along each other, aside each other, that's good. It seems to me, though, there's also, and I'm not talking about, you know, the big conflict, the Israeli-Arab or Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm talking about the internal Jewish conflict. There seems to be a lot of potential also that there is a lot of explosive material in there, as everybody who lives or has lived in Israel knows. So in that respect, I think we have, on the one hand, still drivers for normalization, and we have drivers for the unique role, and that's why I ended with religion, which increasingly takes a religious component, which nobody in 1948 would have predicted or thought. Ben Gurion was convinced, that's why he also gave a lot of concessions to the Orthodox, that they, and mainly to the ultra-Orthodox, right, we're talking about, that they would remain as tiny segments. So that is part of, I think, the uniqueness, which is defined very differently than 50 or 100 years ago.
And it's a good demonstration of the famous saying that from all human errors, prophecy is the most avoidable one. So the prophecies...
Especially for historians.
Especially for the historians. And definitely these visions of, especially when we're looking at it from the vantage point of 1948 and the very labor Zionist hegemonic sort of ideals, often Israelis today, when they're going back and revisiting these moments, they either offer nostalgic narratives of decline and sort of where did that go, where did that disappear. Others see it as actually an opening. Suddenly, so my two twin questions would be whether you subscribe to either one of those narratives, sort of a narrative of decline, missing the good old times or not. And the second one, and that's sort of the historian in me, that's always a daunting task of putting your finger and trying to say, where did that start, right? So where do you, in that big cake, we need to slice it up by dividing it into periods. So do we have a moment in which this transformation...
That's two big questions. So I think I'll leave the history of decline to historians of the Roman Empire. They have done this a lot. You know, we're not here. But I just want to say, you know, historians always, you know, as scholars in general, are critical. We look at critical, you know, we don't want to write laudatory histories, and I didn't do that either. But of course there is the other side. I mean, there is Israel, things which nobody could have predicted also in a positive way, in the high tech. Just the economic standard. I mean, although the downside, of course, is the gap between rich and poor is growing, but the economic level, which is, society which is at much higher levels per capita in many ways than many European states is. People when the state was founded, or even the first decades, did not predict that. So of course, this is there too, and so I don't think it's a history of decline. It's a history of decline only if you had a certain idealized model of this sense of community of the old yeshuv. And actually, Rivlin in this speech says this very nice. He said, we all used to sit around the campfire, maybe, allegorically, but, and we had this sense we were all this big family, and mainly mainly Ashkenazi secular Jews. And now the society is so much more diverse. But I think that is also a big asset. It is one of the most interesting because so diverse societies. So the other question was about the periodization.
Right.
Well, I'm not obviously the first one to say that, but I called 1967 the second founding of Israel. And I'm not the first to say that. Things changed, of course, after 1967, especially since it seemed that in the mid-1960s, certain developments came to a halt and stabilization started. The military administration for, let's say, the Arab population of Israel stopped in 66. And so a lot of things had just become normal when things became very different again. And I don't want to talk, the book is not about wars, and the book is not about deconflict. But of course, 1967 changed Israel internally. And whatever you want to start with, the settler movement, 1977, the rise for the first time of the right wing to government. For the first time, you had no socialist government or social democratic, whatever you want to call it, which in a way is also a healthy sign, because you had one party ruling, not only the first 20 years of Israel, but the 20 years before in the Zionist movement. But overall, I think the polarization has grown. That seems to be a global phenomenon, which we see, of course, in this country and elsewhere too. And in Israel, it is especially, you feel it because it's such a small country, I have to tell you. So 67, of course, is, but I don't want to limit it down to 67. I think there are many other developments which are important, and you can take another war or an intifada, but I think there are long-term developments. And for me, looking at the society, it is really what Rivlin said in that speech. It's the slow demographic change, which may not be so slow if you look at the birth rate of the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox population, which has an average of 6.7 children. It's changing a little bit, it's going down a little bit, but even if it goes down more, that will change Israeli society. And that also means if you add to the Haredi population the other population that does not serve in the army, and that's the Arab population, you have a large segment of the Israeli society that will not be part of that kind of uniting force, the army. It's a growing segment of the population, and we all see how Israeli society tries to cope with that, and how, on the one hand, some parties want to change that, and at least for the Haredi population, make them go to the army, and the resistance is enormous.
And I think that, taking these, last comments and taking us really to the early pre-state of the years, I think that one sees it very clearly from your book, but it's a constant feature in Zionist history, pre-history, that it's a good demonstration of the famous saying that, in a room with two Jews, you already have at least 4 opinions, right? So you're calling the book in search of an idea. But in a sense, the book chronicles so many debates, disputes that start way before 1948 about is a Jewish state? What should it be? How to define it? Is there something that allows you to connect these sort of early debates and understanding post-1948 developments?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I think let's put it the other way around. They grow out of them. Without them, it would be hard to mention. But they are also so different in nature. Just take Jabotinsky and Begin. I mean, there is a huge difference, but it's also a difference of time. You don't know what Jabotinsky would have said in, 1950s or 60s had he lived, but he died in 1940. But his last book, which is a very interesting book about the Jews in the war, and he has kind of a model, a draft constitution of the future Jewish state, which, by the way, nobody knew it would be called Israel yet in 1940 even. And it's interesting because in 1940, Jabotinsky says, if there is a Jewish prime minister, there should be an Arab vice prime minister. And if there, even more, he says, if there is an Arab prime minister, there should be a Jewish vice prime minister. So he imagines there could also be an Arab prime minister. Now, okay, he writes it at a time when the Arabs were still the clear majority in this country. He also has in mind a different, the borders. The borders were never clear. For Jabotinsky, the borders were both sides of the Jordan. So he thinks of more of an idea of a confederation. It's a state. It's ironically, and that's the point I make, and I'm sure some colleagues won't like it, but I think in that respect, Jabotinsky and the right-wing nationalists are very close to the left-wing, left of the Mapai, the ones who basically opted for a binational state. Because if you look at Jabotinsky's last book, it's a binational state, right? So this, of course, is very different. And I think if I don't know if Bibi ever read the book, or let's say he did, and his father was a historian. What do you make out of it? Do you just push it aside? Do you say it's a different time? Jabotinsky actually, in all the figures, and I know you deal with Jabotinsky too, he is in many ways the most fascinating because he is both a liberal and a nationalist. And maybe some of our colleagues make him too much of a liberal today, but he is a fascinating figure. I mean, he translated, Italian.
Poe?
Yes, Edgar Allan Poe. His Italian was supposedly so perfect that he always bragged that he could speak a different Italian dialect so well that people in different regions of Italy thought he was from there. And he, became the fighter for Greater Israel.
My reading of Jabotinsky follows this, but it's slightly more damning. He called himself Altalena, which is a swing, and he changed his opinions, right, according to his name. And of course, the famous ship was named after him. But I liked your comment because it helps me at least to clarify something that I find it paradoxical when sometimes students or friends are coming and asking me often about items in the news when Reuven Rivlin is again criticizing Benjamin Netanyahu and say, look at Rivlin, and they mistakenly see him sort of as a representative of a Meretz kind of an ideal because he's opposing Netanyahu's vision, and he's coming from the old school, the old guard Beitar movement, and he, in a sense, an echo of that old attempt of some would argue have it both ways, both be a national and a liberal at the same time, but of course in very different circumstances. In a post-1967. With Israel that is occupying significant territories in other people. So it changes the dynamic, the circumstances change the dynamic radically. To what extent, you think that these even contemporary politics in Israel, or even needs this historical perspective, or is it simply completely divorced from both history and ideology, simply responds to the most recent, reacting to the most recent stimulus or crisis, or do we have some sort of understanding of Israeli politics and culture and society today by understanding there is some sort of longer outlook, ideological or perspective?
I don't, I'm sometimes, maybe shouldn't be surprised, but it's astonishing how, politicians don't usually read history. Right. Some do, and they don't read earlier visions. So Shimon Peres, for example, who you would maybe, who, by the way, inaugurated the center 20 years ago. So Shimon Peres maybe is the one person you would think, oh, he probably, is right. So in 1990s, he writes a book, interesting book. He writes it with someone, of course, but he writes a book, My Journey with Theodor Herzl Through Israel. And in the beginning he says, well, I've never read Herzl. And he was in his 70s. And he said, wow, he said, I now read Old Newland. And it opened my eyes. So once, it's interesting. And then he goes through Israel with the eyes of Herzl, who wrote Old Newland. And the book is interesting, but what I found really interesting is that he says, I didn't know Herzl. We all talk about Herzl, but I didn't know Herzl. And the same may be true for, Likud politicians, Jabotinsky and so on. So honestly, I think only in marginal, as historians, we see this all based on, on their predecessors and on their ideals. But what people know about them is phrases, is often catchwords which are totally distorted. And Herzl is the best example. I think Herzl is fascinating to read. He was crazy in many ways. In 1896, to write a book like Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, he was considered totally crazy by most of his contemporaries. And he was a very respected journalist and editor of the most respected German language newspaper at the time, the Neue Freie Presse in Vienna. And even in his own newspaper, where he was so respected, the editors-in-chief, who were both assimilated Jews, refused to even print one line about a Zionist Congress or Herzl's Zionist activities. And even when he died in 1904, in his newspaper, in the Viennese newspaper, there was a whole page obituary. And it went on about his literary criticism and his plays. And then there was the last line, and he also founded the Zionist movement. So that's how it is. And by the way, I know this is a little not relating to the question, but I kind of always like to tell the story in Washington because there is a sad connection with the Herzl family in Washington. Some of you might know or have heard. So Herzl's family story was very sad. He had 3 children, and one daughter was killed by the Nazis. She spent actually most of her life in mental hospitals before that. He had another daughter who was a morphine addict and at some point basically killed herself with morphine, 1930 in Bordeaux. And he had one son, Hans. Hans had converted to different religions, Anglican Church, whatever, a few times. But he was very close to this daughter. In 1930, he rushed to see her when he heard she was very sick, and he came too late. She had just died, and he killed himself in the same hotel room where she had stayed in Bordeaux. And there was one grandson of the daughter who was killed by the Nazis. He was named after his grandfather, Theodor Neumann. And he was a soldier and an officer in the Second World War. And he came through Palestine in 1945, 46, and he was celebrated the last Herzl descendant alive. And a year later, he came to Washington, and he jumped off the Massachusetts Avenue bridge and is buried here in D.C. So in a way, the Herzl story ended, the Herzl family story ended in Washington, D.C. And the last remark, and again, that relates also to how the stories are told. In Israel, as anywhere in the Jewish world, people didn't like to talk about the Herzl children. It wasn't such a, nice story to tell, and also that the son converted. Because in his last will, Herzl actually had expressed his wish that once a Jewish state is established, he and his parents and his children, by the way, not his wife, they had not a great relationship, but he said he and his parents and his children should be reburied in the Holy Land. And then he and his parents, there was a big ceremony right after the state was established, and Mount Herzl was dedicated. And the sons, the two children whose grave exists, the daughter killed by the Nazis, we don't have a grave, but the other two, there was no talk about them, and they were not brought to Israel until a few years ago when one historian digged up this history. But that's also dealing with history, right? How are the images of the leaders transmitted?
And how ideas are practiced. It's always so. In a sense, maybe the best testimony for Herzl. I like the fact that you focus more on his utopian novel than on his political writings, because sometimes you understand more from these semi-fictional ideas about the future, and also the translation, as you know, gave us the name Tel Aviv, right? When someone was looking for a new word in Hebrew that will connect old and new, you have, hence we have Tel Aviv.
We're the only city named after a novel.
Right. They still live in a novel. We'll open up the floor for a question from the audience.
Do we have mics, or how do we? Okay, but if you talk loud until the mic comes, then why don't you start?
Okay, thank you very much, Michael Kurtz.
Sure.
When I read Herzl's many years ago, I remember a sentence, I think from Out Neuland or from the Jewish state, stated basically, and when the Jews were once ingathered in one place, they will find they cannot get along with each other. And I heard the same statement from a taxi driver 2 years ago driving me to Lod from my brother's farm. He said he said the same thing. He said, one problem we have with Israel is we cannot get along with each other. So what would Herzl say about today? We always thought decades ago that Israel would implode. The enemies would keep Israel together and keep them tight. But the question is now is the internal situation. And one thing that you said is interesting to me, because a cousin of mine who lives in Kfar Yoshua in Israel said, our schools here are turning into religious institutions. And he said the first graders, as you said, 51% of them are in Orthodox schools and so on, not in the secular ones. So how do you see that? Thank you.
Well, the first question, I think of that too, but I can't answer it. If Herzl lived today, he wouldn't be Herzl. If Herzl lived today, I can just, guess, just as you can. I think he would, he probably would have, if he was Herzl, he would have problems to just get along because he didn't know Hebrew. And he was convinced that the languages in this state should be the civilized languages of, Europe, German and French and English and Italian. And he thought that this state would be a kind of small, the best of Europe. That's clearly what he wanted. The very best of Europe, he says, the English boarding schools and French opera houses and, of course, Viennese coffee shops. And some of that, you have in Israel. I think better ones than here, coffee shops. Maybe not opera houses, but
Luckily,
but
you
they
don't
have an
have
opera
to
house.
go with that suit.
And so he would be happy about many things, I think. He was also, today we would say naive, but it's easy to say today. He thought there wouldn't be a conflict between Arabs and Jews. And he idealized that very much. It's not that he ignored. Many people think, right, he didn't see he did see there was an Arab population, but he was of the belief that with all that civilization that would come from Europe, everybody should be grateful, and they would embrace it, and they would welcome the new immigrants. And in fact, in Old Newland, he speaks about this new society, and the one segment which lives there and which is not welcome are what he calls the fanatics, and these are the Jewish fanatics in his novel, which are the ones who don't want to live together with others. That's very interesting. They're not part. They can live there, but they're not part of his new society. So that may answer also a little bit the second question. Eran?
So, Michael, congratulations. I want to ask a question of a topic that I don't think that either of you have mentioned yet this evening, and I'm going to honor my father, who passed away a few years ago. He was from what Israelis call Dor Shtashach. He was a young man in 1948. And so in his later years, he and I used to talk a lot about those very significant years. And so one of the things I said to him at some point is, wasn't it a miracle that in 1948 suddenly there was a nation? And so he grew up during that time in what was then Palestine that became Israel. And he said, no, it wasn't that much of a miracle to me. I'm paraphrasing him. I don't remember his exact words. But he said it wasn't that much of a miracle for me because of Hamedina Shebaderech. And what he explained was that the institutions were so strong at that point that for him as a young man, it was so obvious that there would be a nation in 1948 that it wasn't a miracle.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Actually, I do have quite a lot in the book about this, Hamedina B'derech, the institutions that were there, everything. The Hebrew University was founded in 1925, the cultural institution. The army, in a way, in its paramilitary stage was there, and the Knesset in its pre-parliament stage, there were elections. So they were all there, that's right. The one qualification I made is that it wasn't necessarily clear, and I don't know if Arie wants to add to that it would become what we now think is the only outcome, an independent state. There were all these, and that includes Jabotinsky and the others, until, I would say, even the early 40s. There were other models which would be some kind of sovereignty. It could be a kind of autonomy under the British rule. It could be a dominion. That was a model very much discussed, and Arie dealt with that too. Or other models which didn't necessarily have to be independent states. After the Second World War and after also the basically downfall of colonialism, that changed. And of course, after the Holocaust, that changed too. So that is the only thing I think sometimes I would qualify. But all the institutions for either an independent state or a semi-independent state were established long before. That's absolutely true. I think the Holocaust, and we take it for granted, but I think the Holocaust did change a lot. It changed a lot on the one hand that, of course, it showed the world, and many Jews, by the way, American Jews, took sometimes longer than that there should be a Jewish state. Jews should have their own state. But it showed also to the non-Jewish world. And even after the Holocaust, when Britain didn't open the doors to Holocaust survivors, that kind of gave the rest. But it also, of course, went in a way the other direction sometimes. If you think there's 6 million people who, many of them could have been potential citizens. Ben-Gurion said at the time, it used to be that people could not imagine there would be a state, for the people. And now he said, and people can't imagine that there's suddenly maybe no people anymore, but we have the state. So in that way, yes. But yeah, it's very important to have the Medina Badel, absolutely.
So you spoke a little bit about the Arab minority and about kind of the surrounding region. So I'm kind of curious, this is kind of a two-sided question. The first is to ask more about the modern double standards in the sense of why is there such a sort of insistence that, Israel must be 100% right in everything she does, and yet, you spoke a lot about the media as well, can ignore the treatment in the past of Jews from other Arab countries. And then the flip side of that coin is with the something like 20% Arab minority, what could happen if, for example, they were included in the draft? Is that a good thing for the state to modernize and to become just like other states in that it includes all of its citizens equally? Mm-hmm. Or does that kind of limit, how Jewish of a state it can be?
Mm-hmm. So the last question, yes, in an ideal time, that would be, of course, the goal. I think we're not in any close to that. And I think we are at a point where both Jews and Arabs in Israel, for different reasons, agree that there are Arabs who serve in the army, but there are few. But that they mostly would not serve because that would create a big conflict for them and for Israel. So both sides have their own reasons. But what you said before is more complicated. Yes, it's interesting because when you, in a way, create this idea that Israel should be a model state, should be better, then you have to be measured according to that. And what happens if the conditions of the state don't allow you to live according to the ideals you want to live, right? I'm not saying that, yes, there is occupation, and yes, there is also not, Arabs have equal rights in Israel, but in a way they also don't. We all know that. There are differences, right? But there are also reasons for it. So it's not that it's meanness or it's mean-spiritedness. So you have, I think, these ideals, but you don't have the conditions to implement them. Now, I don't want to, this shouldn't sound apologetic either, but in many ways, I think if Israel would be, if Moses had led the Jews to Switzerland, and Israel would be there, it might be a little bit easier. It's not.
Thank you very much for your book, and I wanted to ask you another aspect of demography.
Yes.
You alluded to the fertility of certain segments of the population, but as a sociologist, I'm interested also in the ethnicity.
Right.
You really speak of the origins of Zionism and true as a European Ashkenazic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the inflow of the Sephardic population, especially in the early days of bringing in the immigrants, had a higher level of fertility too than the traditional Ashkenazi, not the Haredi or
Right.
ultra-Orthodox.
Right.
How has this division of the Sephardic influx of the population influenced our views of the state
Yeah.
and of the Zionist idea?
Yeah. No, it's a very important question because the Zionist idea really originated in Europe and there were always some others, but it was clearly, first of all, an Ashkenazi Western or East European also, of course, tradition. I would say among all of the divisions, and maybe Arie, you want to say something about that too. I don't know if you see it the same way, and you don't have to. Of all the divisions in Israeli society, this seems to me the one that is fading away more than the others. So you have a real political divide, like in this country. You have a real divide between secular and Orthodox, and that's not fading away. But the Ashkenazi, whatever you call it, Mizrahi, Sephardic, whatever, divide, there's so many people in Israel today, young people, who can't say I am this or that, but one of my grandparents is from Egypt, another one is from Hungary, one is from Poland, one is from Syria. So this, I think, not saying it's disappeared, and it has new challenges with Ethiopian Jews, and I deal with that in my last chapter too, with a different kind of immigration, which also includes non-Jews, both from the Soviet Union, but also, we see now what's happening with the African refugees. That's, of course, a very hot topic. But also others, not necessarily non-Jews, but you have this whole phenomenon, which I think is fascinating, of people who discover, let's say, their supposed Jewish roots as part of the lost tribes in Burma or India or Uganda or Nigeria or South America. And some researchers say there are more people in the world who think they descend from, the lost tribes than actual Jews. And that these could be potential citizens of Israel, theoretically. So I think we shouldn't totally dismiss it as something crazy. And some of them have made it to Israel, not that many. So you have new components, and especially the Soviet immigration brought in a whole, yes, most of them are Ashkenazi, of course, but they're also different than the other Ashkenazi. So you have more than just the old Mizrahi Ashkenazi divide. Mike?
You mentioned in passing the negation of the diaspora as a theme among some of the thinkers. Certainly, in the early years of the state, there seemed to be a deliberate attempt to ignore or diminish the significance of the culture, the history, certainly of the people who came from the Middle Eastern countries. Could you describe how the thinking related to the diaspora history and the contemporary relations with the diaspora has evolved?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely important. In fact, the idea of the negation of the diaspora, Shlilat HaGola, was a very central idea of most early Zionists, and including Herzl. As I said, he did not think there would be a long term, there would be a Jewish diaspora alongside with the Jewish state. And in the early decades of Israel, I think at least the official idea was very often, over time, they'll come, or they will cease to be Jewish. And that has clearly changed. But it has also changed because, honestly, there's only one big diaspora left. Europe is very small, and I'm saying, I grew up in Europe, but the Jewish communities are very small. And it's really the American diaspora, and unless something very unexpected happens, the American Jews, in their vast majority, will not settle in Israel. So I think there's so many factors which go into that. One is that Israel itself became a state that is no longer dependent on the goodwill of the diaspora. It will become a state that can stand by itself. It can carry itself, and also that the diaspora, there is a an exchange. Kind of, the diaspora can also help us. I mean, politically, look at the United States. It's also good to have a diaspora, and that is something new. I mean, how does Israel deal with the Israeli diaspora I talked about? That's another chapter, and that's more complicated. And it also depends where. Now, one of the hot places for young Israelis to go and live is Berlin. So what about this? Israelis going to Germany of all places, and there's a lot of discussion in Israel. So the conference we're planning in the fall is actually on the Israeli diaspora or diasporas, and we hope to have more answers to your question. But that's on the Israeli diaspora. But it's of course so much, and also in recent years historians have shown that every aliyah, I mean, starting from the first aliyot, every immigration wave has also produced people, and sometimes more people have returned than stayed in these immigration waves. So it is a constant back and forth in many ways over time.
Thank you very much. Tying together many of the strands of the discussion so far, I wonder if you could comment on the publication of your book 2 years ago in Germany. How has the idea of Zionism or Israel evolved in Germany?
Yeah, so the book was a slightly different book, but the first version came out in Germany 2 years ago. Wow. It's interesting because I actually decided to rewrite the book and not just to publish the same book, because it's a different audience, and there is a different. Let's say Europe has a different perception of Israel, and then Germany within Europe has a different one. But I think that in general there is a lot of interest and openness as well as hostility and criticism. So, for example, in Munich, where I still teach every summer, we opened a Center for Jewish History, for Israeli Center for Israel Studies 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and the interest is enormous. And in a way, there is also a closeness because it's only a 3-hour flight. So there's a lot of back and forth, especially among young people. It's much harder from here. In terms of the book, that was your question. In terms of the book, I think it's different because there's not that much literature published. It's a different way of discussion. You don't have this also internally Jewish debates as you have them here. It's a very small Jewish community. So it depends what you look at. In terms of German politics, of course, Germany has been, because of its own past, kind of a force within Europe, within the European Union, to have a more positive influence within European policies towards Israel. But also depending on the government. Certainly Merkel has been a very positive force.
So we have time for one more.
Don?
With the mic behind you.
Just following up on Europe, France has a sizable French population, and there's constant debate about whether the French Jews should go to Israel. Netanyahu invites them. On the other hand, you read that they're trying to make it in France. What's your sense about the situation in France? And what do you think of? Do you see a big movement of French Jews to Israel?
There are French Jews who moved to Israel. The community has clearly diminished in size, but it's still a relatively small segment of the French Jewish community that went, and many of them remain also some kind of presence or home in France. Many of them, by the way, are the Jews who left Algeria half a century ago and did not go to Israel because Algerian Jews had the choice. They were French citizens, and over 90% of them went to France. So in a way, you could say they could have gone 50 years ago, but they went to France. But I'm certainly, I mean, Lisa, you're much more an expert on that than I am. I'm not an expert on the French, France or the French Jewish community, but what I hear, it's conflicting. Depends on who you ask. I have friends who say, we're never leaving. This is our home, and it's like, you American Jews, are you afraid if there is increasing anti-Semitism? Would you leave America? What does it mean? But of course, we all know from history, when do you see that it becomes intolerable? And many German Jews did not see that either. So it's hard, to see when you live during these times. But clearly, the situation in France is not a very comfortable one for many Jews and also for many non-Jews.